you so much. Thank you for having me. Thank you to Bree for that wonderful introduction. Thank you to Governor Walker. I see him in the back. Thank you, sir, for having me today. Thank you to the Young Americans Foundation for hosting, and a big thank you to all of you for coming from, I assume, all four corners of the country to this conference this weekend. I actually see some familiar faces in the audience because I think I've been to many of your campuses to speak to you. Yes, indeed. It's good to see you again. Most of all today, though, I want to thank the K-hive, the hashtag K-hive, for pretending to be anti-racist, but exposing themselves as toxic frauds, actually, who literally support and celebrate institutionalized sexism and racism. But let me not get ahead of myself. I'm here with you tonight to defend the title of my speech, which is actually easy for me to do if we simply believe Joe Biden when he speaks. Biden is institutionalizing racism and sexism. So let me start at the beginning. Kamala Harris has a personal toxic army online. I don't know if you guys are familiar with this. This toxic army online engages, well, not really engages, they attack anybody who criticizes or disagrees with Kamala Harris in any way. They call themselves this online fan club, this toxic fan club, they call themselves the hashtag K-hive. Now, you might be able to guess why they call themselves the K-hive. It is a knockoff of Beyonce's Beehive. Not well done. A not well done knockoff. So the K-hive has recently come after me for a very simple reason. The simple reason will not be a surprise to you, but this K-hive, so you guys remember in 2016 how toxic the Bernie bros were online? How mean they were, how just truly awful and vulgar they were. Well, the K-hive makes the Bernie bros look like nice dudes. The K-hive is so nasty that even Bernie Sanders' staff has asked Kamala Harris to ask her K-hive to stand down. This is how serious these people are. And Kamala, by the way, it's impossible for Kamala Harris to distance herself from this toxic fan club online because she has personally thanked them. She has thanked them, and her husband, Doug, has made phone calls to them. Even Joe Biden has associated himself with them. Biden has said, and I quote, "If I have her team," he's talking about the K-hive, "behind me, I know there's no stopping us." And then Marianne Williamson, you remember the crazy crystals lady from the Democrat primary stage, right? Remember this lady? She even asked Kamala Harris to ask the K-hive to stand down. And the K-hive, by the way, they defend their behavior online. They own their toxic behavior, their meanness, their horrible abuse. This is what they say. They say, quote, "If the K-hive seems to be hostile or toxic, we have every right to be after dealing with a constant misogyny and blatant racism." So they know that they're being toxic, and yet they own it. As I said, a very nasty little fan club of Kamala Harris here. Now, the reason they're after me is because I sent out the following tweet. Are you ready for this? Quote, "It's insulting to women," I said, "to nominate a black woman to the Supreme Court because she's a black woman. This is tokenism. It's tokenism times 2. All women should reject this. Otherwise, how are women supposed to know if they are hired based on qualifications or to fill a gender quota? Biden is harming women." That's it, that's the tweet. That's what I said. So one of the leaders of the K-hive, her name is Shantae Berry, she quote tweeted my tweet and said, "Liz Wheeler is exposing her racial bias." Well, as my youngest sister says, no, Red Heart, I'm not. So obviously that's false, but her main argument, she actually issued an audio spaces, it's called on Twitter, right? She issued an audio rebuttal to my tweet in which she said that I was being a hypocrite because Ronald Reagan also appointed a woman to the Supreme Court based on his promise to appoint a woman, the first woman to the Supreme Court. And this is what I would say. I would say, first of all, listen very carefully to when President Reagan at the time actually announced that he was going to nominate a woman to the Supreme Court. He said he was going to do it, and then he also admits that doing so just based on her gender or primarily on her gender is a disservice to women. So why did he do it? I don't know. See, this is the difference between conservatives and liberals, between Democrats and Republicans. I can stand here as someone who supports the vast majority of things that President Reagan did and say, yeah, that wasn't a good idea. Sandra Day O'Connor was the woman he chose, and she turned out to be a disaster. Wasn't a good call to pick someone based on their gender. Shoulda based it on qualifications only. Because it was tokenism, and look where it led our country. Sandra Day O'Connor, I mean, look at what happened, how she ruled with Planned Parenthood versus Casey. She ruled with the left. That could have been avoided had Reagan picked someone based on their jurisprudence and not based on their genitalia. So Shantae Berry says that by calling out this tokenism, you know, these gender quotas and these racial quotas, that I'm carrying water for white men. And I talked about this on the Liz Wheeler show on my video podcast last week. And while I mentioned this part, when I was reading this part, when I was playing this part of the video from Shantae Berry, my producer in my ear, the great and powerful Jay Hay, starts hooting with laughter while I'm on air. And he says to me, while I'm trying to do a show, he goes, "Well, that's hilarious. You've never carried water for me. I'm the one that carries all the water around here." And I thought, well, that is true. So the k-hive is wrong on many things here. But I do want to talk about racism for a second, because there is racism in this conversation between my tweet and between the response from the k-hive. There is racism in this conversation, and it's coming from the left. It's coming from the k-hive. It's coming from Kamala Harris. It's coming from Joe Biden. So I wrote in response to Shantae Berry, I said, "Did you read what I wrote? It is insulting and it's harmful to women to be hired based primarily on our gender. As a woman, I reject gender quotas. Likewise, we should reject race quotas. Tokenism is incredibly demeaning. We should want equality. We should not want special treatment." Because here's the thing. It's not just a matter of we as women wondering, okay, were we appointed to this corporate board? Were we hired for this position? Were we nominated to the Supreme Court based on our resume, based on our experience, based on our qualifications? Or were we put here because of a quota? It's not just us thinking this about ourselves. It's actually worse. Because if there are gender quotas, then it's not just women wondering. The men who work with us will wonder that about us. And what could possibly be more insulting? What could possibly be more demeaning than walking around your workplace and knowing that your coworkers are wondering if you deserve to be there or not? This is demonstrably harmful to women. It is demonstrably harmful to Black people. It is demonstrably harmful to Black women, and we should reject it. See, this is the difference between equality and equity. Equality means that we support, advocate for, we fight for equality under the law, that there is no institutional discrimination or institutional bias against us for any particular immutable characteristic, that everyone has equal opportunity to succeed. Now, equal opportunity does not guarantee equal outcome, of course. Every person in this room has different skill sets, and sometimes a certain skill set will allow us to achieve a higher level of whatever we're talking about, academics, career-wise, maybe you're an athlete, maybe you're a musician, than somebody else, because we're each given different skill sets. It's the equal opportunity that matters, because you can't force people to have equal outcome. But that's what the left wants to do. The left holds this idea of equity, and they pretend that equity is equality, but it's not. What equity is forcing equal outcome. Now, what happens when you force equal outcome? That requires you to discriminate against somebody else. It requires you to discriminate against the people who might otherwise have placed first or second or third. You have to stop them from placing first, second, or third in order to elevate somebody that you prefer based on an immutable characteristic, occupying that podium instead. And so what is that when we're applying this idea of equality versus equity to Biden's Supreme Court nomination? What does that mean? If equity is discrimination, then Joe Biden is engaging in racial discrimination and sexual discrimination, and not just on an individual basis. It's worth noting, by the way, that there's a huge difference between institutional sexism and institutional racism and individual sexism and individual racism. Institutional sexism and racism mean that there are specific laws in our country that discriminate against someone based on sex or based on race. Individual sexism is your own personal failing. It is your sin. You can eliminate institutional sexism and racism by having equality under the law. You can't actually eliminate individual sexism or racism, because that's a sin, and we, mankind, are fallen. You can discourage it. Thank you. You can certainly discourage it, as we ought to, But there's no way that we can simply eradicate sin. Or if we could, then we're thousands of years too late in doing this. But institutional racism and institutional sexism, that is what Biden is doing. He is re-institutionalizing sexism and racism at the highest levels of our government. And that hurts not only the individuals that he's nominating to the Supreme Court, that hurts all of us, that hurts our country. That hurts our country. So the K-hive, of course, I pointed all of this out. I thought I did a pretty good job of pointing this out. But the K-hive responded and said, honestly, this is BS. What you don't understand, Liz, is that black women have long been denied to serve in the highest chambers and offices in our government since the birth of this country. Of course, that doesn't matter to you, right? Well, wrong, obviously. If there is any person, whether this is a female or male, whether this is a black person or a white person, who is being denied the opportunity to try to achieve something based only on their immutable characteristics, you tell me that specific individual event, and I will stand next to you. I don't care who you are. I will stand next to you and I will decry that. But that's not what's happening at the Supreme Court. That's not what's happening in the US Senate during these confirmation hearings. There's no senator that's saying, oh, you're a white person, or you're a black person, therefore I won't vote for you. No, in fact, it's opposite right now. What's happening right now is Joe Biden is directing the Democratic Party to disqualify from consideration any person with any other skin color or the other gender if they are not female and if they are not black. That is institutionalizing racism and sexism. Now, again, this fan club of Kamala Harris, who I find it entertaining to parry with, like to get inside the minds of the other side, they accused me of being a hypocrite again. They said that I was engaging in tokenism because I celebrated when Amy Coney Barrett was nominated to the Supreme Court. I know, don't boo or anything. We don't know yet how she's gonna rule on Dobbs versus Jackson Women's Health. So we'll see if my celebration was warranted or not. But here's the thing, they scrolled through my Twitter feed and pulled my old tweets about Amy Coney Barrett as proof that I was engaging in tokenism if it was a white woman. But here are the tweets that they pulled. This is what I tweeted on October 17th of 2020. I said, I am lolling watching the hashtag Women's March 2020. Imagine pretending you champion women, but protesting Amy Coney Barrett, a law professor, a federal judge, a former Supreme Court clerk, happily married, mother of 7, and now a Supreme Court nominee, but the left hates her because they love abortion more. And then on November 26, 2020, I said, I'm thankful today for Justice Amy Coney Barrett. But what is the theme in my tweets? Does my theme have to do with gender? Does my theme have to do with skin color? No, it doesn't. It has to do with her jurisprudence, or what I thought at the time her jurisprudence might be. It has to do with her resume, her experience, her qualifications. It has nothing to do with racism or sexism. So is that tokenism? Of course not. Is that hypocrisy? Of course not. Again, there are two types of racism and sexism. There's institutionalized and there's individual. And the institutional racism and sexism is coming from the left, is coming from Joe Biden. And the individual racism and sexism is also coming from the left, is also coming from the K-hive. There was a review, I saw this, so I flew in last night. I flew into Atlanta last night, and while I was on the plane, I was trolling through my social media, as we do, and on my Apple Podcast page, I read the reviews on there that you guys leave me. Appreciate the good ones, so thanks for that. But there was a 1-star review, and I was like, oh no, what is this going to be? Do you guys want me to read this to you? Okay, this absolutely slayed me. It slayed me. Okay, a 1-star review, seriously, come on. This is what the title was, Liz Wheeler is anti-black. And I was like, oh, this is gonna be a doozy. This is what the review is. That's all. That's the review. She's your typical white woman that weaponizes her white woman tears when she's called out by black women on Twitter, especially for her anti-blackness that she displays in micro and macro aggressions. That's it, that's the review. She says that I'm anti-black because of my white woman tears. What does that mean? What does that mean? That means nothing. That means that they have nothing to say. That means they have nothing to say substantially against my argument. They cannot debunk my argument. What they can do is they can display both their institutional racism and their individual racism. This is a tweet that I got from a member of the K-hive that shows exactly what I'm talking about. Quote, baby, when folks go low, I go to hell. F her and her armadillo crocodile skin. End quote. And the leader of the K-hive responded, word. Okay, so the point of all this, what is the point of all this? The point of this is we have a history in our country. We have a long history of fighting to overcome our sins. We have a long history of fighting for the marginalized, of fighting for equal rights for every person, regardless of their race, regardless of their skin color, regardless of their gender. And Joe Biden is reversing the course of our history in this nation. Joe Biden is re-institutionalizing racism and sexism. When you look at what's happening at the Supreme Court, a lot of conservatives are uncomfortable talking about this topic because they don't want to face accusations of being bigoted. They don't want to face accusations where leftists twist their words. Leftists are famous for saying, well, Liz Wheeler doesn't want a black woman to sit on the Supreme Court. No, I don't care at all what the race of the person on the Supreme Court is or what the gender of the person on the Supreme Court. They could be faceless blobs for all I care, as long as their jurisprudence is upholding the Constitution. That's all I care about. That's all I care about. But equity, make no mistake, equity is discrimination, and each and every one of us in this room should feel comfortable saying that. Equity is discrimination. Tokenism is racial discrimination and gender discrimination. This is a sad thing that's happening in our country that we're letting happen. What would be the slippery slope to this? What would be the end goal? What's the limiting principle on equity, on racial discrimination, on gender discrimination, if we don't put a stop to this? Biden is institutionalizing racism and sexism. It hurts women. It reduces each and every one of us in this room to our immutable characteristics, to our gender, to the color of our skin. This is the opposite of what the civil rights movement did. This is the opposite of Martin Luther King's idea that you should be based on the content of your character. You should be judged on the content of your character and not judged on the color of your skin. Biden and the Democratic Party are reversing this. They're trying to make our nation a racist nation. And by the way, these same leftist activists, these partisans, they don't actually care about anti-racism. They don't actually care about equality. They don't actually care about equity. They don't even care about their own identity politics. You know how we can tell? Look at how they treat Clarence Thomas. Look at how they treat any woman who dares to be conservative. Look at how they treated Amy Coney Barrett before she was confirmed to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court seat should be about one thing and one thing only. It should be about jurisprudence. And you know what? I am delighted to tell you today that the vast majority of the American people agree with me. This is actually not a partisan opinion here. 76% of people, this is according to an ABC poll, you know, ABC is not exactly a bastion of conservatism. An ABC poll found that 76% of people want Biden to consider all possible nominees. A mere 23% of people want him to consider only black women for the nomination. And you know what? I am hard-pressed to find very many political issues that Americans on both sides of the aisle agree on to this extent. This is a bipartisan, non-ideological reality in our country that most people recognize, that equity is not equality. Equity is discrimination. Biden is engaging in institutional racism and sexism, and we all should reject it. Thank you very much.
Alrighty, ladies and gentlemen, we are entering our Q&A portion. Same deal as before. Remember to keep your question short and concise. Remember your name and the school you're from, and we'll take the first question.
By the way, guys, before we start, if you guys want to counter that 1-star review, head on over to Apple Podcasts, give me a 5-star review, and write me a glowing one.
Hi, my name is Amelia Johnson. I go to the University of Iowa. Go Hawks. All right. I am originally from Texas, though, and my grandparents did grow up in the Jim Crow South, and they were discriminated against because of their color of their skin. Civil rights gave them many chances to become the people that they are. My grandmother has been a public school principal for 20 years, one of the highest rated in Central Texas, and my grandfather is a decorated war veteran from Vietnam. So my question is, especially since 2020 and the rise of BLM, I feel like I have been reduced back to the color of my skin by my liberal friends. So how do I point out their hypocrisy in that?
Well, first of all, it sounds like you have a fascinating family history. and your grandparents are an example of the American dream, where they were able to achieve what they were able to achieve even in the face of our founding principles being misapplied and discriminating against them. So thank you to your grandfather for his service to our country. My favorite tactic when talking to liberals, and it's not just a gotcha tactic, but my favorite tactic is to ask questions. So ask them first, do you define me based on the color of my skin? What matters the most? The color of my skin or the content of my character? Do you know how equity works? Meaning, do you know that equity requires discrimination? And if we allow the government to play a discriminatory role at the institutional level, where does that end? What's the limiting principle on that? And then listen for what their answers are. Help them come to the proper answers, because we know that the narrative coming from the Black Lives Matter movement is false. We know that cops do not indiscriminately target Black people, especially in police-involved shootings, based on the color of their skin. That simply doesn't happen. The Black Lives Matter movement tells us that that happens all the time. The actual statistics, meaning the FBI homicide statistics on police-involved shootings, show that to be false. So you can ask your friends that question too. What about the Black Lives Matter movement leads you to believe that Black people are facing institutional sexism right now? What about the statistics about police-involved shootings leads you to believe that you are in danger just driving down the street if you're pulled over by a police officer? I find that questions that are difficult to answer if you've embraced the radical leftist ideology is the best way to crack through their ideology if they're interested in having a dialogue with you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, my name is Joshua Ototola, and I go to Kennesaw State University. I'm a pro-life activist, and when discussing abortion, the people on the pro-abortion side will usually say, I shouldn't have an opinion on abortion.
Could you slow down just a little bit? I'm having a little hard time hearing you.
Okay. Yeah, I'm a pro-life activist, and when discussing abortion, the people on the pro-abortion side will say, I shouldn't have an opinion on abortion because I'm a man. I often try to point out how it's an ad hominem fallacy, but because they base the argument off of emotion, they usually ignore that. What's the best way to answer the question?
Well, you certainly have a right to have an opinion about abortion because you're a man. So don't accept the premise that you, as a man, cannot have an opinion about abortion. In fact, in our culture, we are in desperate need of good, strong, godly men who stand up not only for... who stand up for women and who stand up for the unborn. So the first step in that is simply reject their premise that you have no right to speak. What they're doing by telling you that you have no right to speak is they're trying to silence you. So you have to ask them, or ask yourself, why are they trying to silence you? They're trying to silence you because they know the power of men speaking up. They know the power of men supporting women. They know the power of men speaking out in defense of unborn children. So just reject their premise. There is no other issue in this country where we accept the idea that certain people, based on certain immutable characteristics, are not allowed to take part in the discussion about a certain political topic. So I would just call them out on their BS just right from the beginning and go ahead and have your pro-life opinion.
All right.
Hi, Liz. My name is Julie Hill. I'm from Baltimore, Maryland. And my question for you is the vaccine mandate has divided a lot, and I am wanting to stay in the DMV area, but they have chosen to kind of ostracize us by testing, by masking. So do you have any advice on just how do we fight back without allowing them to succumb to us to then want to move out to either Florida or Texas, where it is free, where the DMV is not very free right now? So any advice?
Yeah, it's a really tough situation. My husband's a medical provider, and facing the vaccine mandate, he lost his job. And this is it really hits home to people, right? When it starts impacting your family, when it starts impacting your job, it's a difficult thing to do. My advice to you would be twofold. First of all, I would say there's nothing wrong with moving to a red state where your freedoms are being protected. The idea of the federalist system of our country is that states are supposed to be laboratories of democracy. So when a state like Florida or like Texas is upholding your freedom, that should be rewarded by the value that you bring to the economy, the value that you bring to the state. And likewise, when a state like New York or California or the Washington, D.C. area is not upholding your freedoms, when they're violating it, they should be punished. They should lose the value of you living there. So first of all, there's nothing wrong with moving away, because eventually market forces will help decide which states are going to survive the mandate and which are not. So that's the first thing. The second thing is, I really advise you to hold strong. I'm holding strong, my husband's holding strong. We need people who are committed to pushing back against this tyranny by our individual actions. I did an episode of my show last week after the Joe Rogan controversy, where I posed the question, who would you choose if you had to choose just one person to be your champion against the COVID vaccine tyranny? Would you choose Joe Rogan, or would you choose the Canadian trucker convoy? Oh, right, it's a good one. And the reason that I ask this is because conservatives oftentimes make the mistake of waiting for a savior to come and be their fighter, that we'll support Donald Trump as our fighter, we'll support Joe Rogan as our fighter, we'll support JP Sears as our fighter, whoever it may be, someone in a position of influence or in the public sphere who is speaking out in the right way. And we wait for that person and we'll give them our support. But I pose this question, that people that are in a public position, especially one who is not necessarily political like Joe Rogan, they have a lot to lose when they face this pushback from this leftist apparatus, whether it's big pharma, whether it's big government, whether it's big media. They have a lot to lose. I mean, he has $100 million to lose, right? Whereas a grassroots movement like the Canadian trucker convoy, they've already lost. Now, I don't mean they've lost the battle. I mean, they don't have anything left to lose because they've already lost their freedom. They've already lost their opportunity. They've already lost their ability to do their jobs. And so what do they have to lose? They don't have the same thing to lose that Joe Rogan has to lose, or that a president of the United States has to lose, or a politician has to lose. There's a power inherent to grassroots movements that actually exists in the fact that they're faceless. Meaning we don't know any celebrities that are involved in this. You probably couldn't name one trucker who was involved in this, and yet we see headlines constantly, not just in Canada now, but all around the world. And so the point of all this is that you resisting just as an individual person, you saying, I'm not going to show a vaccine passport, even if I've been vaccinated. I'm not going to go to establishments that are forcing me to wear masks. I'm not going to participate in this violation of our fundamental rights. You as an individual make a really big difference. There was that restaurant in Washington, D.C., the Big Board, that I went to when I was in D.C. because they were the only place not checking vax cards. That was one restaurant, and think of the publicity, think of the support that they got, because they were the only ones in the city that were willing to say, nope, Mayor Bowser, we are not going to be your enforcers. We're not going to be agents of the state. And so it can be hard. You have sacrifices to make. Maybe you won't be able to go to restaurants. Maybe you won't be able to go certain places where you have to wear a mask. But I would say that this fight is not just about COVID. It's not just about vaccines, and it's not just about masks. So I'd really encourage you to be as strong as you can and have faith.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Hello,
Hi.
I'm Theo Batty. I'm a student at Bishop Lynch High School. My question for you is, so I'm part of a specific part of the American population. I'm a wheelchair user, and I think there are certain interests that the wheelchair population might have. So I can see why someone would want a wheelchair, a person with a wheelchair in the government, say Congress or the Supreme Court, to defend these interests that we specifically have. What would your response or thoughts be on that?
Do you think that I'm unable to represent your interests just because I'm not in a wheelchair?
I think someone in a wheelchair might be able to understand the problems and make it a priority more, if that makes sense.
Do you think that we are all in this room, every single one of us, unable to advocate for the unborn because we are not currently in utero?
Not at all.
So what I'm doing is just using a rhetorical thought experiment to say that I think that if you have the servant's heart that you're supposed to have as a public servant, hence the name, if you have the proper jurisprudence, if you're on the judiciary, that it is your job to understand I suppose more as a legislative issue, to understand the interests of your constituents. And that's why we have the voting system that we have, because if we have a member of Congress, for example, who's not representing your interests, well, you have the power to talk to them first, you have recourse, you have the power to publicize it in a newspaper or on social media, and then you have the right to vote against them for somebody else, and then fourth, you have the right to run against them if they're not representing your interests. I think that if we allowed the idea that someone could only represent your interests if they share a characteristic, then we wouldn't be getting very far. I mean, we have relatively few representatives compared to the enormity of the population of our country, and the vast majority of them don't share characteristics of, I don't even know what the right word here is, but they share very generalized characteristics, right? It's not a matter of looks, it's not a matter of skin color, it's not a matter of gender, it might not even be a matter of ability status, it's a matter of, are you looking out for the best interests of your constituents? And if you aren't, then we have recourse against that. So I'm not looking for someone who shares my immutable characteristics. I'm looking for someone who's going to defend my freedom, who's going to defend the Constitution, because in the Constitution provides all of us the opportunity, regardless of these things, to try to live in the most prosperous nation in the world, to try to enjoy life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. If they don't understand that, then we should vote them out.
Thank you very much for your insight.
Hi. First off, I'd just like to say thank you for coming and speaking to us today.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
My name is
Appreciate it.
Simeon Brungard, and I'm a homeschool high school student from Mechanicsville, Virginia. As I'm looking at colleges and different schools, I'm noticing that a lot of them implement affirmative action and certain things, and they're picking, specifically picking students based on either sexuality or the color of their skin. And I was just curious, because when I go to people who are either currently in college or people who have already graduated, they're like, oh, well, it's just to make a more diverse campus. What are your thoughts on affirmative action?
Well, this is a really interesting question. So this is one of those issues that it's a timing issue, right? That different times in our country, there's been different needs for different policies, like unions, right? There was maybe an argument that unions were necessary at a certain time, and that now unions are harmful and unnecessary. I think that's the same thing with affirmative action. I think, look at what's happening at Harvard, for example, where I think everyone on both sides of the aisle, actually, except for perhaps very radical leftists, agree that what's happening is racial discrimination against Asian Americans. Because in order to be accepted into some of these Ivy League schools, if you are Asian, you have to have an SAT score that's vastly superior to your white counterparts and your black counterparts and your Hispanic counterparts. And the same thing, if you're white, you have to have a test score superior to your black counterparts and your Hispanic counterparts. And I think that's very racist. I think that's discrimination. Now, if you're a private institution, a truly private institution, meaning you don't accept any research funding, any grants, any money from the taxpayer and the federal government, then I suppose you can do what you want. I wouldn't send my kid to a school that did that, because I think that's racist and discriminatory, but it is racist. It goes back to the idea of what I was saying in the speech. It's equity. It's trying to achieve equal outcome when equal outcome requires discrimination. I am not interested in the left's version of diversity. I look at people for their mind, I look at people for their heart, and I look at people for their character. I don't care what color hair you have, I don't care what gender you are, I don't care what color skin you have. You should be accepted into a school, if that's what we're talking about, since you're talking about colleges, based on your academic achievements. Perhaps if you've had a really significant event in your life that has impacted you in a great way, that should be considered too. It doesn't have to be just SAT scores, but who you are as a person should factor into an admission into a school more than the color of your skin, because if we reduce people to the color of our skin, we've been down that road in our country before, and it's not pretty.
Thank you.
Good afternoon, Ms. Wheeler. Thank you for being here this afternoon. My name is Rhett Wilson. I'm from North Greenville University. Go Crusaders. And we're so happy to be here.
Wow, look at that team spirit.
Yeah. So my question for you today is, as you've mentioned earlier, you're obviously against identity politics, tokenism, those kind of ideas. But I've heard people on the right say that in order to win elections, especially on a national level, say if we elect another white guy as our presidential candidate, Ron DeSantis, then we've got to have Kristi Noem or Tim Scott as a VP to win that identity politic group in order to win elections. Do you think that that's a necessary evil we've got to follow, or do you think we're past that?
No, I think Republicans make a huge mistake playing into tokenism, being like, oh, guess what, we have a black Republican, or we have a woman that we like who's a Republican. That's so stupid. I hate that so much. In fact, I'm glad you mentioned Ron DeSantis, because Ron DeSantis, through his actions, has debunked this. Why did he win the gubernatorial race against Andrew Gillum in 2018? He won the race by 30,000 votes coming from black women who had children in the school choice program in Florida, These black women are known as school choice moms because they are black women who are registered Democrats, who voted for the Democrat Senate candidate in the same election, in the 2018 election, and yet they crossed the aisle to vote for Ron DeSantis, a white man, a Republican, for governor. And the reason for this was because Ron DeSantis was actually representing their interests. Their interests being they wanted their children to have a better education, and he was saying the best way to give your children a good education is through voucher programs, through school choice. Conversely, the man running against him, Andrew Gillum, called charter schools a siphon on the public school system. And so we don't have to have politicians who look a certain way, meaning a certain skin color or a certain gender. It doesn't matter what their immutable characteristics are. It matters whether they're representing the interests of their constituents, whether they are purporting a limited government constitutional philosophy as the answer to helping people live the best kind of life that they can possibly live in this country. And so I would challenge Republicans. I would even scold Republicans who engage in tokenism, but I would challenge Republicans, do not buy in to the identity politics of the left. You do not have to virtue signal in order to win. All you have to do is communicate our values in a way that answers the needs of the people in our country, both on the left and the right, and then we'll win elections.
Thank you, ma'am.
Mm-hmm.
Hi there.
Hi.
My name is Alexander Diaz. I go to the Catholic University of America in Washington, D.C.
I remember you. We met when we were at Catholic University.
Yes, when we hosted Verdict with Ted
Yes.
Cruz. That was really fun. My question is, so we're here in Georgia, and then I'm from Arizona. So in these states, we've made a lot of progress as conservatives with sort of building the states that we want. But now, sort of with elections, we've been struggling to win them and that sort of thing. How do we win back the middle so that we can keep making the progress that we have been when it comes to pushing conservative ideas and conservative policies?
Yeah, that's a good question. The answer to that is partially what I just said in my previous answer. It's making sure that when we as conservatives talk about politics, we're not talking about it just how we want to hear it, meaning we're not just trying to convince other people to care about our issues because we care about them, that we are first listening to constituents, to voters' needs and saying, okay, I hear you, I hear exactly what your need is, and my answer to you, what will best serve your need, is this policy that we have. And so we have to make sure that our policies really fit the needs of constituents. The other way to do this is to identify the issues where there is some partisan crossover, meaning there's partisan crossover. The poll that I mentioned in my speech tonight about the tokenism, about Biden's Supreme Court nominee, this is something, this tokenism is abhorrent to people on both the right and the left, so we should talk to people on the left about what Democratic politicians are doing. It will turn them off to Democratic politicians. Abortion is actually, believe it or not, another issue where the vast majority of people in our country agree. The vast majority, 80% of people think abortion should be illegal in the third trimester. 60% think it should be illegal in the second trimester. So we should find the areas where people on the left and the right agree. School choice is another issue. Democrat voters are in favor of school choice. Black voters are in favor of school choice. Hispanic voters are in favor of school choice. It's the white liberals in Washington, D.C. who are saying Democrats are against school choice. So Republicans have an opportunity in these areas and more. There are other slivers of areas where there's already polls that show that the voters agree on both sides of the aisle, but we should exploit these. We should use these. We should make sure to say, hey, listen, I know you support school choice, so do I. I know you want abortion illegal, so do I. I know you don't want racialized Marxism, racial tokenism in our government. We don't want institutional sexism and racism, neither do I. And that's how we should communicate to these voters, because truthfully, at the end of the day, aside from the Marxist political operatives who work, for New York Times or MSNBC, this very small fraction of the Democratic Party, the voters are actually open to hearing, oh, okay, you're offering what will best serve me, then I'll vote for you. I'm not ideologically tied to the Democratic Party, and the Republican Party needs to recognize that.
Thank you.
Hi, Liz. I just want to thank you for coming out today. I really enjoyed your speech. My name's Nick, and I'm from the University of Virginia. Yeah, wahoo wah.
Ooh, I don't know who was louder. They might have been a little bit louder.
And I'm a proud Puerto Rican American. And as a Puerto Rican American, I often get called white passing because of the color of my skin. And that I have white privilege, despite my family's, just insurmountable difficulties that they've gone through in life. I guess my question tonight is, how would you best approach a conversation on the left's so-called white privileges?
Well, white privilege is bullshit, right? Totally. The left uses race to try to divide us. So the best thing to do in these conversations is to try to undermine the premise. Once you get into the weeds on these arguments, if you accept even the hair of their premise, then it's going to be a losing battle. You just want to you want to debunk identity politics before it's even applied to any issue. So, I mean, again, going back to the very first answer, you just ask the questions. What is white privilege? What have I been able to achieve that you haven't based on the color of my skin or the color of your skin? Do you think that we should be defined by the color of our skin? Is there any law that applies unequally to people based on their immutable characteristics? So, and challenge them. Say what you're doing right now is you're just echoing, you're just parroting radical leftist talking points. You're playing identity politics, but you really don't know what you're talking about. You really don't know what the implications of identity politics are, or you wouldn't be playing that. And then ask them, define identity politics. Define everything that you're talking about, and I think you'll get somewhere. The other part from a personal perspective, I mean, that's when you're engaging in a conversation with a leftist, but the other part is make sure that you surround yourself with a community of like-minded people. Meaning, I mean, you're already obviously part of the Young America's Foundation. That's the best place on campus. Oftentimes on these liberal campuses, the best place to find people who are like-minded, where there's diversity of thought, is in the YAF Club. It is in the Young America's Foundation. They do a great job of making sure that you don't feel isolated and alone on campus. You already know this. That's why you're involved. It's really important. It's also important to have a family structure that's supportive, to have a faith community that's supportive. And then what I do is I make sure to read every single thing that I possibly can on the right and on the left. I read all of their stupid, ridiculous, critical race theory stuff. I read all of their identity politics stuff so that I actually am able to engage in a debate. Because one of the core parts of identity politics or critical race theory is actually anti-whiteness. They're not just looking to tell history through the lens of marginalized people, as they say. They're not just looking to tell the bad parts of our history about slavery. Obviously, we were all taught about that in school, and all children should be taught about that in school. It's part of our history, good and bad. It should be neutral. But really, if you read their literature, you'll find that identity politics is based in a supremacy, whether it's a Marxist supremacy, whether it's a black supremacy. It is based in an ideology that is poisonous. It's anti-American, it's anti-Christian, and most students on college campus, especially if they're willing to engage in a debate with you, probably don't support that type of radical poisonous ideology. And so being able to show them, say, listen, this ideology that you're talking about is actually racist in and of itself, will make a difference.
Awesome, thank you, appreciate it.
Hi, Liz.
Hi, how are you?
Good, how are you?
Good.
My name is Al Morgan. I'm from Michigan State University. Go green.
I'm not playing the ref on that one.
Hey, Tuck's coming.
Your basketball team sucks.
As a big defender of the pro-life movement, I'd just like to know your thoughts on the death penalty.
Yeah, great question. This is an area where I've been called a hypocrite because people on the left and some people on the right will say, how can you be pro-life if you support or you're okay with capital punishment? And my answer to that is, well, I'm glad I'm not a hypocrite. I don't support capital punishment, so good try. And hear me out, though. Hear me out. There's a lot of conservatives that are like, ooh, weak on crime, and I'm like, wrong again. Hear me out. So the reason why I'm not in favor of capital punishment is because, again, this is a timing issue. There were times in our country where capital punishment might have been necessary. There were times in our country where the idea of justice being that we are trying to restore order to our society, we are trying to protect those innocent people and their inherent rights from being violated by somebody else, required us to put people to death in order to restore the order to our society and to protect the innocent from being violated by somebody, a criminal who had already proved that they were willing to violate somebody else's inherent rights, right? So we're not at that point anymore. We have maximum security prisons, which are not being, we don't see jailbreaks there the same way that we saw in the Wild West, for example. We don't have facilities where it's impossible to incarcerate somebody without threatening someone else's livelihood, even to the point of, isolation. We really have the capacity in that sense to make sure that an individual is not a threat to other people, is not going to violate somebody else. That's the first thing. The second thing is there have been too many mistakes in capital punishment in our country, especially since the 1970s, where innocent people have been put to death and then exonerated after they had already been put to death based on DNA evidence. This is, in my opinion, inexcusable. Our justice system is based on the idea that it's not a matter of being guilty or innocent, it's a matter of being guilty or being not guilty, meaning we cannot prove that you are guilty. Now, what does that mean? That means that we are willing in our justice system to let guilty people walk free if we cannot, as a jury, meet the standards of proving beyond a shadow of a doubt that that person is guilty. Well, that standard applies to capital punishment as well. Now, I'm not advocating that we let murderers walk free, that we let child rapists walk free. No, no. What I'm advocating for is looking at the statistics of how many people have been wrongly put to death versus the idea that we can house these people in maximum security facilities without a threat of them harming someone else. So we shouldn't accept that the government has a right to put people to death. I mean, that's a slippery slope to begin with. But we shouldn't accept that government has the power to put people to death and then accept the fact that the government has put innocent citizens to death. That is not okay. The third reason is the fiscal reason. It is not a fiscally conservative policy, meaning we do not have a system where someone is convicted of murder and they're put on death row and that sentence is quickly enacted. No, no, it's decades usually before someone is actually executed. What happens in the interim between their conviction and sentencing and when that sentence is actually carried out? Well, appeals, years and years of appeals. Not only, and that's extremely expensive. If you weigh the amount of money that it would cost to just house someone for life without parole in prison versus the amount of money that it costs to go through these appeals process for decades before you even get to the capital punishment itself, it's more fiscally responsible to just put the person in jail for life without the possibility of parole. So for those three reasons, in addition, of course, it's coupled with the fact that I'm Catholic, I'm Christian, I understand the dignity of life itself, but I also understand the idea that if we put someone to death and they have not repented for their sins, then they could very well be condemned to hell. And that's a pretty hefty responsibility to hold on our shoulders when we have other options that would protect the innocent. And so if there's a possibility of allowing them, keeping other people safe, allowing them the possibility to hopefully repent so they're not condemned to hell, then we should try to do that as well. So for those reasons, I'm against capital punishment.
Thank you.